The alarm system screamed across every screen in the Galactic Council chamber, and the sound made everyone stop what they were doing. For 3,000 years, the barrier around the Sol system had held strong and kept the humans locked inside their own small corner of space. The Council had placed them there for a reason, and that reason was fear. Humans were too aggressive and too unpredictable, and worst of all, they were creative in ways that made the older alien races very uncomfortable. Every simulation the Council had run showed the same result, and that result was danger. If humans were ever allowed to spread across the galaxy, they would either unite everyone under their banner or burn everything down trying. Either option terrified the Council, so they had built a quantum barrier around the entire solar system and pretended Earth did not exist. Commander Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Wanderer and watched the stars spread out before him in a way no human had ever seen before. The ship hummed with power beneath his feet, and he could feel the vibrations through his boots. His crew of 200 people had worked in secret for 15 years, and they had done the impossible. Every scientist on Earth said it could not be done, but Jake and his team had proved them wrong. They had found pieces of alien technology floating in space near the edge of their solar system, and those pieces had given them clues. The fragments were from monitoring probes, and the probes were watching Earth. Someone out there knew humans existed and that someone had been keeping secrets. Dr. Lisa Kennedy stood next to Jake, and her fingers moved quickly across her tablet screen as she read the incoming data. She was the head of the science team, and without her brilliant mind, they never would have cracked the mathematical puzzle that held the barrier together. Her brown hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her green eyes were wide with a mixture of excitement and fear. The numbers on her screen were showing something impossible and something wonderful. The barrier that had caged humanity for thousands of years was gone, and they were free. Lieutenant Danny Wright sat at the communication station, and his headset was filled with noise. Dozens of voices were speaking in languages that sounded nothing like anything humans had ever heard before. The translation software was working overtime trying to make sense of the chaos, but some patterns were emerging. Most of the messages were demands, and all of them wanted the same thing. They wanted the human ship to turn around and go back to Earth where it belonged. Jake looked at his second-in-command and saw his own determination reflected in her eyes. Commander Helen Price was a veteran of the United Earth Space Force, and she had trained most of the crew personally. Her jaw was set in that stubborn way that meant she had made up her mind about something. She gave Jake a small nod, and he knew they were thinking the same thing. They had come too far to turn back now. Jake pressed the button that would broadcast his voice across every frequency the ship could reach. His words would be heard by every alien civilization within range, and he wanted to make sure they understood. Humanity was done being a prisoner, and nothing was going to change that. He spoke clearly and calmly, even though his heart was beating fast in his chest. He told them that humans demanded to know why they had been locked away, and he told them that humanity would not accept being caged anymore, and the Council world of Verdania, the leaders of 100 different alien species, watched the human ship continue on its path toward the nearest inhabited star system. Prime Arbiter Zexthar was an old being who had lived for 500 years, and in all that time he had never seen the Council so frightened. Some members were screaming for military action, and others were demanding that the barrier be rebuilt immediately. A few were even suggesting that the human ship should be destroyed before it could reach any populated worlds. Zexthar studied the data about the human vessel, and what he saw both impressed and worried him. The ship was primitive by galactic standards, but it showed remarkable engineering for a species that had only recently achieved faster-than-light travel. More importantly, the way it had broken through the barrier showed creative problem-solving that matched every prediction about human behavior. They had been given an impossible puzzle, and they had solved it anyway. Counselor Vren spoke up from her crystalline seat, and her voice carried across the chamber like breaking glass. She wanted to know how the humans had escaped when the barrier was supposed to be completely unbreakable. The technology used to create it was far beyond anything Earth should have possessed. There should have been no way for them to even detect the barrier, much less find a way through it. Zexthar gave the only answer he could, and that answer made the room fall silent. The humans had adapted, and adaptation was what they did best. Every time their species faced an obstacle, they found a way around it or through it or over it. They had survived ice ages and plagues and countless wars among themselves. They had built weapons capable of destroying their entire planet, but somehow they had chosen not to use them. They were walking contradictions, and that made them more dangerous than any enemy the Council had ever faced. The debate continued for hours, but Zexthar already knew how it would end. The Council would have to make contact with the humans whether they wanted to or not. The barrier was gone, and it could not be rebuilt without trapping the human ship outside of it. That would mean humanity would have access to galactic technology and knowledge without any supervision at all. The only option was to bring them in and try to control what happened next. Jake watched the stars pass by the view screen and wondered what would happen when they reached their destination. The Wanderer was heading toward a massive space station that appeared on their sensors like a bright beacon. It was bigger than anything humans had ever built, and it was surrounded by hundreds of ships from dozens of different civilizations. This was Kepler Station, and it was the gateway to the inner galaxy. Lisa came to stand beside him, and she spoke quietly so only he could hear. She said the aliens were afraid, and fear made people do dangerous things. Jake nodded because he knew she was right. The next few hours would determine whether humanity had a future among the stars, or whether they had just started a war they could not win. The Wanderer slowed as it approached Kepler Station, and Jake could see hundreds of alien ships holding position around the massive structure. Every vessel had its weapons powered up and ready, but nobody was shooting yet. That was something, at least. The station itself was like a small moon made of metal and glass, and it sparkled with lights from 1,000 docking ports. Ships of every shape and size moved around it like insects, around a hive, and the whole thing hummed with activity. Danny turned from his station and reported that they were being scanned by at least 50 different sources. The alien ships were studying the Wanderer from every angle and trying to figure out what kind of threat it posed. Helen had already ordered all defensive systems to standby mode because the last thing they needed was for some automated system to misinterpret their intentions and start a fight. Lisa was recording everything her sensors could detect, and her tablet was filling up with data faster than she could read it. There were species out here that humans had never dreamed of, and technologies that seemed to break the laws of physics as Earth understood them. Some ships appeared to be made of living crystal, while others looked like they were held together by pure energy. One vessel seemed to exist in multiple places at the same time, and Lisa had to stop looking at it because it made her head hurt. Jake opened a communication channel and broadcast on all frequencies again. He identified himself and his ship and stated that humanity came in peace. The words felt strange coming out of his mouth because how do you claim peaceful intentions when your entire species had just broken out of an alien prison? He explained that Earth had only recently learned about the quarantine and that they wanted answers. More than anything, they wanted to understand why they had been locked away without ever being told that other intelligent life existed. The silence that followed his message seemed to last forever. Jake could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, and he was aware that every person on the bridge was holding their breath. They were so far from home and so completely outnumbered that any wrong move could end in disaster. Earth would never even know what happened to them. Finally, a response came through, and the voice was translated into English by their computers. The accent was strange, and underneath the translation they could hear clicking and whistling sounds. The speaker identified themselves as a representative of the Kepler Station Authority, and they said that the human vessel was not welcome. The quarantine had been put in place to protect the galaxy from dangerous species, and humans had been classified as extremely dangerous. By breaking through the barrier, Earth had already proven that the Council's fears were justified. Helen made a disgusted sound and muttered something about the hypocrisy of being called dangerous by people who had imprisoned an entire planet. Jake understood her anger because he felt it too. Every person on the Wanderer had grown up believing that humanity was alone in the universe, and that reaching for the stars was a noble dream. Now they knew the truth, and the truth was bitter. They had never been alone, and the silence from the cosmos had been deliberate. Danny suddenly called out that a single ship was breaking formation and approaching their position. The vessel was small compared to the others, and it was broadcasting a peaceful greeting. Jake ordered all weapons to remain on standby, but he felt his muscles tense as the unknown ship drew closer. This could be a trap or it could be an opportunity, and there was no way to know which until it was too late to change course. The alien ship docked with the Wanderer after a brief exchange of technical information, and soon Jake found himself walking to the airlock with Helen and Lisa beside him. They had no idea what to expect on the other side of that door, and Jake had to remind himself that this was what they had wanted. Contact with alien life was the whole point of breaking through the barrier, even if the circumstances were not what they had hoped for. The airlock opened, and Jake got his first look at an actual alien being. Ambassador Tyvek of the Aryan Collective was humanoid in shape, but his silver skin seemed to shimmer in the light, and his eyes were completely black with tiny points of light that looked like distant stars. He was tall and slender, and he moved with the grace that seemed almost unnatural. When he spoke, his voice was warm and welcoming and nothing like the cold reception they had received from the station. Authority, Tyvek, apologized for the hostile greeting and explained that the Galactic Council was very old and very set in their ways. Change frightened them, and humans represented a massive change to the established order. However, there were many species who believed that the quarantine had always been wrong, and that humanity deserved a chance to prove themselves. He said that he was one of those believers and that he wanted to help Earth navigate the complicated politics of galactic society. Lisa asked the question that everyone wanted answered, and that question was simple. What exactly was the Council afraid of? Tyvek's expression became serious, and he gestured for them to follow him to a private conference room. Once they were seated, he told them a story that chilled Jake to his core. 20,000 years ago, another aggressive species had entered the galactic community, and they had called themselves the Devourers. They had been charming at first and had promised peace and cooperation. Within a century, they had shown their true nature and begun a campaign of conquest that had lasted for 500 years. By the time the united forces of the galaxy had finally stopped them, a third of all known space had been destroyed or enslaved. Entire civilizations had been wiped out and whole planets had been burned to ash. The psychological profile of the Devourers matched humanity almost perfectly. They had been aggressive and territorial and fiercely loyal to their own kind. They had advanced technologically at an incredible rate, and they had shown a willingness to take risks that other species found reckless. Most importantly, they had been creative problem solvers who refused to accept that anything was impossible. Sound familiar? Tyvek asked. Helen leaned forward and her voice was tight with controlled anger. She said that humans were not the Devourers, and that judging an entire species based on the actions of a completely different civilization was exactly the kind of prejudice that started wars. Jake agreed, but he also understood the Council's position. If humanity really was similar to the Devourers, then the galaxy had good reason to be afraid. Tyvek nodded and said that was exactly the debate that was raging across Council space right now. Some believed humans should be returned to quarantine by any means necessary, while others thought Earth deserved a chance to prove they were different. He had invoked an ancient law called the right of witness, which would allow humanity to present their case directly to the Council. It was a long shot, but it was the only chance they had. The Wanderer followed Tyvek's ship through a series of jump points that took them deeper into Council space than any human had ever traveled. Jake assembled a delegation that would represent Earth before the galaxy, and he chose his people carefully. He picked Lisa because she could explain complicated ideas in ways anyone could understand. He chose Helen because she would not back down from anyone, no matter how powerful they were. He selected Carlos Rodriguez because the linguist had a gift for understanding not just words, but the meanings behind them. Karen White joined them because her studies of human culture gave her insights that nobody else possessed. Finally, he brought Lieutenant Derek Shaw because if things went wrong, they would need someone who understood military tactics. The Council homeworld of Verdania was beautiful in a way that took Jake's breath away. 3 suns hung in the sky and bathed everything in golden light. The buildings were impossibly tall and seemed to grow out of the ground like trees made of crystalline metal. Flying vehicles moved through the air in patterns that looked chaotic, but somehow never collided. The whole planet hummed with energy and life and technology that Earth could only dream of achieving. The Council chamber was even more impressive than the planet itself. The room was vast enough to hold thousands of beings, and every surface seemed to be made of some material that shifted colors as Jake looked at it. Representatives from hundreds of different species filled the space, and the diversity was overwhelming. Some looked almost human, while others were so alien that Jake's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. There were beings made of gas that floated in containment fields and creatures that existed partially in dimensions Jake could not perceive. Every one of them turned to stare at the human delegation as they entered. Prime Arbiter. Zexthar called the session to order, and his voice resonated through the chamber in a way that seemed to bypass Jake's ears entirely. The sound came from inside his head, and it carried a weight of authority that made him want to stand at attention. Zexthar explained that this gathering was unprecedented because no quarantined species had ever broken containment before. The law was clear, and that law said such breaches should be met with immediate return and reinforcement of barriers. However, Ambassador Tyvek had invoked the right of witness, which gave humanity one chance to make their case. Jake stepped forward and felt the weight of billions of eyes watching him, even though most of those eyes were watching through screens across the galaxy. This moment would determine the future of his entire species, and he could not afford to fail. He spoke clearly and honestly about how Earth had spent thousands of years reaching for the stars because they believed they were alone. He talked about the shock of discovering the barrier and learning that they had been deliberately isolated. He explained that humans did not break through the quarantine out of aggression, but out of a desperate need to know the truth. Counselor Vren interrupted, and her voice was sharp like breaking glass. She listed every war and atrocity in human history, and there were far too many to count. She talked about genocide and slavery and environmental destruction. She pointed out that humans had come dangerously close to destroying themselves with nuclear weapons multiple times. How could the Council trust a species with such a violent history, she demanded. Lisa stepped forward, and her voice was calm but firm. She acknowledged that human history was full of terrible mistakes and that Earth had no right to pretend otherwise. However, she pointed out that humanity had learned from those mistakes. Wars had become less common over time, and cooperation had become more widespread. Humans had chosen to step back from the nuclear brink and had begun the long process of healing their planet. She asked if the fact that humanity had survived its own worst impulses should not count as evidence that they could change. Another counselor spoke up, and this one resembled a massive insect with multiple eyes and clicking mandibles. He said that the Devourers had also spoken of peace and learning from mistakes before they had revealed their true nature. Pretty words meant nothing when actions told a different story. What proof could humans offer that they would not follow the same path? Carlos activated his tablet, and holographic images filled the air above the delegation. The images showed moments from human history that the Council files had apparently missed. Rescue workers pulling strangers from collapsed buildings, doctors traveling to distant countries to treat diseases, ordinary people donating time and money to help those they would never meet, soldiers throwing themselves on grenades to save their companions, parents sacrificing everything for their children, artists creating beauty in the midst of horror. Karen spoke next, and her words were passionate as she explained human nature. She said that every culture on Earth had stories about heroes who gave everything to save others. The details changed, but the theme was always the same. Humans valued courage and compassion and self-sacrifice. Yes, they were capable of terrible violence, but they were equally capable of incredible kindness. They were not simple creatures who could be reduced to a single label. They were complex and contradictory, and that was what made them human. The chamber fell silent as the images continued to play. Jake saw representatives whispering to each other and gesturing at the screens. Some looked thoughtful while others seemed unconvinced. Zexthar studied the delegation for a long moment before announcing that the Council would deliberate in private. The humans would have their answer within 3 solar cycles, which Karen quickly calculated as roughly 72 Earth hours. The delegation was given quarters in a building near the Council chamber, and the next 2 days were the longest of Jake's life. They could not return to the Wanderer because protocol required them to remain on planet during deliberations. They spent the time reviewing everything they had said and wondering if it had been enough. Tyvek visited them several times to provide updates, but even he could not predict which way the vote would go. On the second day, something happened that changed everything. An emergency signal came from a mining colony on the edge of Council space. Raiders had attacked the facility and taken hostages. The Council's military forces were too far away to respond in time, and the raiders were demanding a ransom that the mining company could not pay. Standard procedure was to negotiate while help was on the way, but in this case help would arrive too late. The Wanderer was only 6 hours from the colony. Jake made his decision in seconds. He contacted Helen, who was still aboard the ship, and ordered her to plot an intercept course at maximum speed. Helen asked if he was sure because intervening in Council business without permission could destroy any chance humanity had of being accepted. Jake said he understood the risk, but he would not let people die when he could prevent it. Some things were more important than politics. The council was informed of the Wanderer's course change, and Zexthar demanded to know what the humans were doing. Jake explained the situation and said that his ship was going to rescue the hostages. Several council members objected and said that humans had no authority to act in council space. Others argued that any unauthorized military action would be seen as proof that humanity was too aggressive to be trusted. Zexthar overruled them all and said the humans would be allowed to proceed. If they succeeded, it would be counted in their favor, and if they failed, it would prove the council's fears were correct. Helen stood on the bridge of the Wanderer and watched the raider ships grow larger on the view screen. There were 6 vessels arranged in a loose formation around the mining colony, and each one bristled with weapons that looked crude but effective. The raiders were a mix of different species who had turned to piracy when they could not make honest livings in galactic society. They preyed on isolated outposts and remote facilities that were too far from council protection to be safe. Danny had intercepted their communications, and the translation software painted a clear picture. The raiders were demanding payment in rare metals, and they had threatened to start killing hostages if their demands were not met within the hour. They had done this before in other systems, and the council had always paid rather than risk civilian lives. The criminals had no reason to expect this time would be any different. The Wanderer dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system and immediately began accelerating toward the colony. Helen opened a communication channel and broadcast to all the raider ships at once. She identified herself and her vessel and gave them one chance to surrender. The hostages needed to be released immediately, or the Wanderer would take action. Her voice was calm and professional, but there was steel underneath the words. Laughter came through the speakers, followed by mocking comments in several different languages. The raiders had dealt with council forces many times before, and they knew how the game was played. First came demands and then negotiations, and eventually someone would pay the ransom. They had never encountered humans before, and they had no idea what they were dealing with. One of them responded in broken English and told Helen to go back where she came from before she got hurt. Derek was already at the weapons station, and his fingers moved across the controls with practiced precision. The Wanderer had been built in secret over 15 years, and every system had been designed with combat in mind. Humans might be new to space travel, but they had spent thousands of years perfecting the art of warfare. The ship's weapons were simple railguns that fired metal projectiles at incredible speeds and missiles, with guidance systems that could track multiple targets. By galactic standards, the technology was primitive, but that did not make it any less deadly. Helen gave the order to fire, and Derek's targeting solutions were already locked in. The Wanderer's gun spoke, and 3 raider ships found their engines destroyed in a matter of seconds. The weapon's fire was surgical and precise, and it disabled the vessels without destroying them or killing the crews. The raiders had expected threats and negotiations, but they had not expected immediate and overwhelming force. The remaining 3 raider ships tried to flee, but they were slower than the Wanderer and less maneuverable. Derek tracked them with calm efficiency and called out each shot before he took it. Engine disabled on target 4. Weapons knocked out on target 5. Navigation systems destroyed on target 6. Within 20 minutes, all 6 raider vessels were drifting in space, completely helpless and unable to fight or run. Helen contacted the mining colony and told them that the immediate threat was over. She said the Wanderer would be sending a boarding party to secure the hostages and make sure none of the raiders could cause any more trouble. The colony administrator sounded shocked and grateful in equal measure. No council ship had ever responded so quickly or acted so decisively. The boarding party was led by Helen herself, because she would not ask her people to do anything she was not willing to do. She took 20 crew members who had trained for this exact situation, even though they had never expected to actually use that training. They wore armored suits and carried weapons, but their orders were clear. Secure the hostages first and use minimum necessary force against the raiders. The interior of the raider command ship was dark and smelled of oil and unwashed bodies. Helen's team moved through the corridors with tactical precision, and they found the hostages locked in a cargo bay near the center of the vessel. 37 beings of various species huddled together in fear, and several of them were injured. The human team immediately began providing medical care while securing the area against any remaining threats. The raiders themselves were found cowering in different parts of the ship. Most had hidden when they realized they were being boarded, and none of them offered any resistance. They had expected many things, but they had not expected humans to be so well trained and so well equipped. Helen's team secured all the prisoners without firing a single shot, and within an hour the situation was completely under control. Back on Verdania, Jake watched the operation unfold on screens that showed feeds from the Wanderer's cameras. The entire galaxy was watching too, because every major news network had picked up the story. This was the first time humans had taken military action in Council space, and everyone wanted to see what would happen. Lisa stood next to Jake and provided running commentary on what she was seeing. The human response had been fast and effective, and most importantly, it had been measured. The raiders had been disabled rather than destroyed, and the hostages had been rescued without any unnecessary violence. This was not how the Devourers would have handled the situation, and everyone watching could see the difference. Carlos pointed out that several of the hostages were species that had voted against humanity in the council debates. The humans had not checked the identities before rushing to help, and they clearly did not care about politics when lives were at stake. That kind of behavior was rare in galactic society, where most species looked after their own first and worried about others later. Karen was recording everything because this moment would become part of human history. The first military action taken by Earth's forces had been a rescue mission, and that said something important about who humans were. They could fight and fight well, but they chose to fight for others rather than for conquest or profit. Helen's voice came through the communication link, and she reported that all hostages were secure and receiving medical treatment. The raiders were in custody and would be turned over to council authorities. None of the crew members had been injured, and the Wanderer was ready to return to normal operations. Her tone was matter-of-fact, as if she had just completed a routine training exercise, rather than humanity's first real test. The mining colony administrator contacted Jake directly and thanked him for saving so many lives. He said that he had voted against lifting the quarantine because he believed humans were too dangerous. Now he realized he had been wrong. Anyone who would risk their own safety to help complete strangers could not be the monsters the council feared. He promised to change his vote when the final decision was made. Similar messages began flooding in from across the galaxy. Species that had been uncertain about humanity now saw them in a new light. The rescue had been broadcast live, and billions of beings had watched humans act with courage and restraint in equal measure. Not everyone was convinced, and some still argued that one good deed did not erase the risks. However, the balance of opinion was shifting in Earth's favor. Zexthar called an emergency session of the council, and Jake knew that the deliberation period was over. Whatever happened next would determine humanity's fate, and there was nothing more he could do but wait for the verdict. He gathered his delegation, and they walked back to the council chamber together. The massive room was filled with representatives again, but the mood felt different than before. There was less hostility in the air and more curiosity. The Prime Arbiter stood, and his presence commanded absolute silence. He began to speak, and his words were transmitted across the entire galaxy so that everyone could hear the decision that would change everything. Zexthar's voice filled the council chamber and reached across the galaxy to billions of waiting ears. He spoke about the 3,000 years that the quarantine had been in place and how it had been created out of fear and caution. The council had believed they were protecting the galaxy from a potential threat, and perhaps they had been right to be careful. However, the events of the past few days had challenged many long-held assumptions and forced everyone to reconsider what they thought they knew about humanity. The Prime Arbiter gestured toward Jake and his delegation and continued speaking. These humans could have remained hidden and waited quietly for the council's decision. They could have played it safe and done nothing that might jeopardize their chances of acceptance. Instead, when they learned that lives were in danger, they had acted immediately without hesitation. They had saved 37 beings from species they had just learned existed, and they had asked for nothing in return. That kind of selfless courage was rare in the galaxy, and it deserved to be recognized. Councillor Vren rose from her crystalline seat, and her voice had lost much of its earlier hostility. She said that she had spent the past 2 days reviewing the complete history of humanity, rather than just focusing on the violent parts. What she found had surprised her. Yes, humans were capable of terrible things, but they were equally capable of remarkable compassion. They had a pattern of choosing cooperation over destruction and growth over stagnation, even when it would have been easier to choose violence. They made mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes were catastrophic, but they learned from them and tried to do better next time. Other council members spoke and shared their own observations. One talked about how human art and music showed a species that valued beauty and emotional expression. Another mentioned human scientific achievements and how they had accomplished so much with so little. A third pointed out that humans had nearly destroyed themselves, but had chosen to pull back from the brink, which showed wisdom and self-control. The debate continued, but Jake could sense that the mood had shifted. Fear was being replaced by cautious hope. Not everyone was convinced, and several counselors argued that one rescue mission was not enough to prove humanity was safe. They pointed out that the Devourers had also seemed reasonable at first and had only revealed their true nature after gaining trust. Some species would always be too dangerous to risk, and perhaps humans were one of them. Better to keep Earth isolated than to gamble the safety of the entire galaxy on hope and good intentions. Zexthar listened to all the arguments before calling for a vote. The chamber fell silent as each council member registered their decision through systems that humans did not fully understand. Jake watched lights appear on a massive display that showed the running tally. Green meant yes to lifting the quarantine. Red meant no to keeping it in place. For several long minutes, the lights flickered and changed as votes were counted and recounted. The final result appeared, and Jake felt his heart skip a beat. 73 green lights against 27 red ones. The quarantine was over. Humanity had been granted provisional membership in the galactic community. The chamber erupted in sound as different species reacted to the news in different ways. Some celebrated while others expressed disappointment. Jake just stood there trying to process what had happened. Zexthar raised a hand and silence returned. He explained that the decision came with conditions because the Council was not ready to give humanity unlimited freedom. Earth would be monitored to ensure they were following galactic laws. Human expansion into space would be gradual and supervised rather than unrestricted. Any aggressive actions or violations of treaty would result in immediate sanctions and possible return to quarantine. However, if humanity proved itself worthy of trust, then those restrictions would be gradually lifted. Jake stepped forward and spoke for all of Earth when he accepted the Council's terms. He said that humanity understood the concerns and would work hard to prove they deserved the chance they had been given. The galaxy had waited 3,000 years to see what humans would become, and now they would get their answer. He promised that Earth would not waste this opportunity. Tyvek approached after the session ended and placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. The silver-skinned ambassador looked pleased and proud. He said that Jake and his crew had accomplished something remarkable and given their people an incredible gift. Now the hard work would begin because earning the galaxy's trust would take time and effort. However, Tyvek believed that humans had the strength and determination to succeed. Lisa was already making plans for what came next. Earth would need to establish embassies and trade agreements. Scientists would want to study alien technology and learn from species with thousands of years more experience. Teachers would need to educate children about their new place in a crowded galaxy. The list of tasks was endless, but Lisa loved challenges, and this was the biggest one imaginable. Helen was thinking about military matters because old habits died hard. The rescue mission had gone well, but it had also revealed how much humans still had to learn. Their weapons were effective but primitive, and their ships were slow compared to what other species could build. Earth would need to upgrade its technology while being careful not to seem threatening. That balance would be difficult to maintain. Carlos and Karen were discussing cultural exchange and how to help Earth adapt to galactic society. Humans would need to learn new languages and customs and ways of thinking. At the same time, they should not lose what made them unique. The challenge would be integrating into the galaxy while maintaining human identity and values. Derek was quieter than the others because he understood something they had not fully grasped yet. The rescue mission had made humanity look good, but it had also revealed their capabilities. Now the galaxy knew that humans could fight and fight well. Some species would see that as reassuring, while others would find it threatening. Earth's military would need to be strong enough to defend itself, but not so strong that it scared potential allies. The delegation returned to the Wanderer and began preparations for the journey home. Jake stood on the bridge and looked out at the stars that were finally truly open to humanity. They had been caged for 3,000 years, but now they were free. The question was no longer whether humans could reach the stars, but what they would do once they got there. Helen joined him at the viewport and asked if he was ready to go home and deliver the news. That would change everything. Jake smiled and said he was as ready as he would ever be. 7 billion people were waiting to learn that they were not alone, and that their world had been deliberately hidden from the galaxy. That conversation would be difficult, and there would be anger and confusion. However, there would also be hope and excitement and wonder. Danny reported that the course was plotted for Earth and they could leave whenever Jake gave the order. The journey would take 3 weeks, and during that time, the galaxy would be adjusting to the idea of humans as members of the community. Some would welcome the change while others would resist it. Earth would need to navigate those politics carefully. Jake gave the order to depart, and the Wanderer's engines hummed to life. The ship turned toward home and jumped to faster than light speed. As the stars stretched into lines of light, Jake thought about what the future might hold. Humanity had proven they could be trusted with one chance, but there would be more tests to come. The galaxy would be watching everything Earth did and judging whether humans truly deserved their place among the stars. Lisa came to stand beside Jake and said that this was just the beginning. The real work would start when they got home and had to figure out how to integrate an entire planet into galactic society. There would be mistakes and setbacks and probably a few disasters along the way. However, humans had survived everything their own world could throw at them, and they would survive this too. Derek pointed out that the galaxy had feared what humans might become. Now it was time to show them what humans chose to be. Not conquerors or destroyers, but explorers and helpers and friends to whoever would have them. The choice had always been humanity's to make, and now they finally had the freedom to make it. The Wanderer sailed through the void between stars, carrying the news that would transform Earth forever. Behind them, the galaxy watched and waited to see what humanity would do with their newfound freedom. Ahead of them lay home and the massive task of preparing an entire species for their place among the stars. The quarantine was over, and humanity's real journey was just beginning.